Hello, welcome to Questions of Life. This is the next video in our series looking at why does God allow suffering. So we get to heaven, not at the moment of death. We get to heaven through a choice that we make in this lifetime. So the choices that we make now have what we would call eternal consequences.
Yes.
So if we choose to follow God in this lifetime, then we're welcomed and we follow him in the next. And if we choose not to, then that's a different story that we'll cover at a different time. And that's because of Jesus. So because of what Jesus has done, we have this opportunity to acknowledge we've messed up, to ask for forgiveness, and we know God in this lifetime and the next. Question from Mike that he sent in is a question about those people that have never heard of Jesus. So there are tribes, there are various people around the world that maybe don't have a Bible, haven't had Christians come and say, well, do you know there's a God that exists? Do you know that Jesus died on the cross? What about them? What happens to them?
I think it's a very important question, and Christians will have different points of view, but my understanding is quite clear. In the Old Testament, people didn't know Jesus. And they didn't get to heaven because they were good people. So one of the key people in the Old Testament who's described as being close to God is King David. Now, we happen to know that King David had an affair, and to cover up his affair, he murdered the husband of the woman he'd had an affair with. That isn't really particularly godly behavior. And yet the New Testament describes him as one of the people close to God. Why? Because we know in his story how he confessed, how he repented, how he turned to God in great anguish and sorrow, and how he acknowledged that he wasn't good enough. And that's particularly found in a psalm in the Bible called Psalm 51. So I believe that David is saved through Jesus' work on the cross, even though he never knew Jesus. Not because he was a good person, but because he asked for mercy, because he knew that he didn't deserve heaven. He knew that if he was to carry on living that way, he couldn't be in heaven. And so he asked God for mercy. And because he asked God for mercy, because God saw that his heart had changed, he said, you can be in heaven. Therefore, I think the same applies throughout the world today. That there will be people who've never really understood Jesus. Perhaps they've seen Christians who are so off-putting that they can't accept Christianity. Perhaps they've been born into another cultural religion that never allows mention of Jesus. So for all kinds of reasons, people may not have been exposed to an adequate explanation of why Jesus dies on the cross. But if their heart's attitude is, I know there's a God and I know I need to say sorry, which I think is part of what God gives human beings. He gives all of us that opportunity. It's called a conscience. I think they will be saved through Jesus. The problem is that as we grow up as human beings, we tend to suppress that conscience and start to move to a thing called pride, which starts to say, I'm the good person and everybody else is not as good as me, or God deserves me and I'm doing well. And sometimes religions pander to that because they make people, if you do this religious thing, if you do this good thing, then you're a good person and all of that. So this whole idea about being good people is really damaging to us. So I think there'll be people in heaven who didn't know Jesus, but they knew that they needed God's forgiveness. And I think there'll be people who are not in heaven who thought they knew Jesus, but they basically thought they were good people. And because they couldn't recognize that they needed to change, they can't be allowed in. We can't have heaven full of people repeating this mess. So unless we see the need to change, we can't go there.
Which is great, because that leads us on to a question that we've just had in that I alluded to a few moments ago. So what happens to all the people that don't make it to heaven?
Okay. So again, Christians have different points of view. And there are three theories in Christianity. And I've changed my mind over the years. I changed my mind when I looked more at the Bible and I realized that what I had been told isn't exactly what the Bible said. So the three views are that those who don't go to heaven live in a parallel universe of their own choice where they just live a non-religious Christian life. No evidence for that in the Bible. I think that's just wishful thinking. But lots of people believe it. But it just doesn't say that in the Bible. The more common view, which was the one I was taught, is that people are in another place for eternity and are tortured. And that, it transpires as I look more into it, is really an idea that developed in the Middle Ages. And sadly, it was part of the church's oppression of people. And it's not really what what Jesus says or what Paul or the rest of the New Testament writers say. It can be construed from one of the parables that Jesus told, which was a parable about making sure we look after the poor. We can go into that maybe another time, but the vast majority of the time Jesus says, if you do not believe in me, you will perish, you'll be destroyed. Talks about the second death. Talks about being consumed in fire. So for me, what I think the Bible teaches is eternal destruction. In other words, that we just cease to exist. The technical term is annihilation. That we are no longer sentient, mortal, living beings. We are dead. We have finished the second death. So heaven is the eternal life of those who know they are sinful and want to change, and hell is the place of destruction for all those who haven't learned that lesson, who, were they to be allowed into heaven, would recreate the same problems.
And God's desire is that people don't go to hell.
He longs that nobody would perish. I mean, that's really clear in why Jesus comes. It talks about this yearning, this desire. It talks about him holding back death to try and get people to believe. It breaks God's heart. He talks about the lost. The language is such pain on God's behalf that people would choose to reject him and choose that destiny.
Absolutely. And so when we're talking about annihilation, just to clear up, it's not a painful thing. It's not like, it's an emotionally painful thing, because when Jesus returns, and the Bible talks a lot about that one day he's going to come back, and there's going to be this judgment of the living and the dead. And the judgment is whether you've repented, whether you've said, I've messed up, I'm sorry, would you forgive me? And then at that point, it's then that there's heaven and then there's destruction. And it's not a horrendous thing, because I believe that God is a God of love. I think the most painful thing, I suspect, for people will be recognizing that Jesus is real. And what have I done?
Yeah, and I think I would just go slightly back to our very first question, which was about our anger at suffering.
Yep.
So I really believe, and increasingly believe, in the importance and the concept of judgment.
Yep.
There has to be a point, otherwise God really is not fair. There has to be a point where God says, you know what, child abuse is wrong.
Yeah.
You know what, murder, war, famine, the way you've allowed these things to happen, global warming, all of this, it was wrong. You shouldn't have done it. I think God has to do it, and part of us wants God to do it now. That's why we get angry with God about suffering.
Yeah.
The point is that God delays that conversation to give you and I a chance to say sorry.
Yeah.
It's a bit like as a parent, when you know a child has done something wrong, you know they've scribbled their name on the wall, because nobody else, it's their name they've written on the wall, and you say, have you got something to tell me?
Yeah.
And they say no, and you say, I'm just going to wait a minute before I do what I'm going to do if you don't tell me what you've done. And that's what God is saying. I'm longing for you to repent.
Yeah.
But there has to come a moment where those who have caused great injustice and suffering in the world, God says that was unacceptable.
Yeah.
And because of that, you cannot come into heaven.
Yeah.
And it talks about that moment being one of weeping.
Yeah.
And I think, as you say, it's an emotional thing. I don't
Yes.
think God is inflicting pain. But I think to be exposed and confronted with what we have done wrong. And we talked about how through my role I exposed to a lot of secondary suffering. So I have walked alongside people who, well, in my own family, my extended family, there's been murder. So I've walked alongside people who have been the victims of serious crimes, And actually to know that one day God will pronounce judgment on that is important, that God isn't silent. So I think there is this day of judgment. I think it's important to and it's part of the whole mix of suffering. Those of us who get angry with God not doing something, we need to understand he will.
Yeah.
He's just waiting.
Yeah, absolutely. But his heart is for
heart
all
is
to
we all
find
turn away
forgiveness
from
in this lifetime. And he's made it as easy as possible.
Yeah.
It's not like we've got to jump through a million hoops and prove ourselves. Jesus has done it all for us, which is the incredible gift of
Yeah,
love.
and we don't have to do 10 times more good things than the bad thing. We don't have to do good. We just got to say, Lord, I'm sorry.
Yeah. It sounds too good to be true, but it's absolutely incredible. Brilliant. Right, I've got 2 text messages here.
Excellent.
Taking you slightly to another place. This is from Laura. Evening, Laura. It says, why are some of us born into rich lives and some of us born into poor lives? It's not fair for the children born into starvation and famine. It's not their fault, but yet they have to endure the suffering.
Yeah, I don't think there's an answer to that easily. I can't, except there is no reason. I'm convinced that God didn't choose any life to be more unpleasant than somebody else's. I think it's random. I do believe that the child that dies is automatically in heaven and blessed. But other than that, there's nothing that any person has done that deserves that. And that's fundamentally why Christianity is diametrically opposed to the concept of reincarnation. And that is why Jesus really offers something different. Once we start believing that our structural suffering is the result of our sin in the previous life, then that gives me the excuse to do nothing about your suffering because it's your fault, because you did something in the previous life. And that then exacerbates and recreates injustice. Whereas for Christianity, it's random that you're born into poverty, and therefore it's not your fault. Therefore, the rest of us need to do something to help you. We can't blame you for it.
So it's random that we're born into poverty. It's not random that we're born full stop. And it's not random that we are the people that we are with our gifts and abilities. Just explain the difference between those, because it's not all random, is it? Because the Psalms talk about God knitting us together in our mother's wombs.
Yeah. So I don't think that human beings exist before they're born. We're not eternal beings. We are created by a mother and father. So God doesn't choose which womb we end up in. We end up in the womb that our mother and father placed us in. But at that point, God has created and shaped who we are, and the way in which our strengths and our skills are part of God's design for us. That design can be damaged and corrupted by our environment, by our family, by other things, but
by biology.
By biology, yeah. But all of us have them because, how can I put it politely?
Don't be polite. You put your legs out.
The birth of a baby is a miracle. Because there are so many wasted eggs and sperm, and I'm not expert, but there's a lot of wastage.
Well, you've got 3 children. You're not doing badly.
There's a lot of wastage in the process. Therefore, the egg that becomes a human being is precious. And God has nurtured that egg.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, we're drawing towards the end. I've got one final question. And this is being texted in again. It says, I'm suffering now. How can I use the church /God to help me cope/feel better. So if someone is struggling, they feel that life's really, really difficult, what would be your top tips? How can they cope and survive and find help in that situation?
I think there's so many different things to say, and a lot depends on the cause of the suffering and the context of the suffering. I think that it's important to hold on to the temporary nature, that God will take this away at some point in the next life or even in this life. So this isn't how it will always be. I think that's important to hold on to, have that hope. I think hope is such a crucial thing to really focus on and look to the time when this will be better. Yeah. I think that's really important. I think it's really important to try to choose not to be defined by our suffering, not to be boxed into the label of I am this victim of this thing, that we're more than what's going on in our life, and to try to reach out to others, to try to see how this can shape us to be better and more caring for other people. I think that just continually, we talked about this every time, continually expressing to God how we feel. Not blaming ourselves for being unhappy, not rebuking ourselves for suffering, but just saying, God, I'm struggling with this. This is really painful. This is really difficult. I'm really hurting. I'm really fearful. And just continually being honest about that to God and just walking through it with him rather than pushing him out. The danger is that we get angry with him and we push him away. And I think it's better to be angry with him rather than at him. So we don't push him away, we pull him in and we express the feelings that we feel. It's good to write, it's good to be creative. There's so much in the Bible about waiting for God. And so just allow the Bible to help. I'd read a psalm a day. We've talked about this before, but there's so much in there about people suffering. And I think the final thing I would say, which opens up the whole area, is that the New Testament for me is pretty clear that those of us that are suffering are more likely, I'm careful what I'm just going to say here, are more likely to be doing what God wants than those of us that are having an easy life. That the New Testament norm is to be suffering. That to follow Jesus will be difficult. One of the tragedies of the Western Christianity is we've somehow communicated that those who are suffering are in some way to blame. Absolutely. And that, I think, is bordering on blasphemy, because actually you talk to Paul and you read Paul, he suffered hugely. You look at Peter and he suffered. You look at John and he suffered. Yeah. So when we are suffering, it's to read the New Testament as these are the people who are suffering with me. These are not the people who are better than me. These are the people for whom I'm a partner with. Yeah. I think don't suffer alone. I think have people who you can share it with, talk to about it. And those of us who are sharing that with others, don't fix it, don't have the answers, just listen, just love, just stay in it with people. I think one of the most damaging things is to walk away from someone you can't fix. And most of us can't be fixed. We need someone to walk with us.
Only God can fix us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But I think for him to do that, I think we have to hold our hands up and say, this is me, that I'm struggling. And I think so many people, because of their fear of what others think, or like you were talking about, well, I'm obviously not a good enough Christian. If they are a Christian, or I'm not a good enough person, I'm struggling, I shouldn't be feeling like this. And you put all these caveats in, I should be better, I should be this, that, and the other. And I think it's really helpful to say that actually struggling and suffering is part of life. That there are no guarantees that everything is going to be okay. that it is walking in the footsteps of Jesus. It is walking in the footsteps of all the Christians that have gone before us. And we rejoice when life is good, and we make the most of it when we're not struggling and suffering, and we're so thankful. But when life is difficult and we're struggling, God hasn't changed. The way God feels about us hasn't changed. His presence hasn't changed. And in those times of struggle, I would say don't trust your emotions so much, because sometimes we're like, I can't feel God, where is he? And I'm quite an emotional person. And again, every week we go back to this plumb line, and we go back to, as you say, the Bible. And you're right, I go back to Psalms. There's so many promises and truths about God in the Psalms. It's in the Old Testament, the first bit of the Bible. So many people that struggled in the Psalms as well, that's what I go back to. That's what I reflect on. And I think, okay, it's not just me. I'm not going mad. I'm not a terrible person. I may not feel it, but God is with me. That God wants to help me in all of these ways. And I think it's, too, having the courage to admit that to ourselves that we're struggling, but to admit it to other people. And I think it's finding the right person / people to admit that to. I think sometimes people tell too many people. And I think you've got to be wise in who you talk to. Somebody that you know listens. Somebody that you know is confidential. Somebody that you know, actually, they're quite wise and they're helpful. But as you say, someone that won't try and fix you, and that you don't go into it thinking, this person can fix me. Because they can't. That comes back down to God, the God who will carry us, the God who will strengthen us, the God who will bring his peace. Not always in the time that we want, not always in the ways that we want, but he will. And so I think you're right. Go to God with our anger, with our frustration, and don't kick him away, but invite him to be part of that, and cry out to him and be real, be raw. I mean, you write a lot of your stuff down, don't you? That's how you kind of get it out and express yourself, and it's finding a way to do that. I know some people that will drive somewhere and will just scream because they need to get out the emotion and the frustration, and life is just so difficult that it's all pent up inside of them. And I suppose it's finding a way that kind of works for us, that's natural to us.
I think one final thing I would say, just that's helped me over the years, is this decision at times to say, I will not give up.
Yeah.
And there's a stubbornness, and there's a sense of, so my dog's come to say hello, there's a sense for me of saying, I will not be beaten by this.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to, I can't jump up and down with joy, I can't fix this, but I am simply refusing to give up.
Yeah.
And that kind of decision, that statement, I will keep going, has helped me. And it's as simple as that. I don't know how I'm going to get through this, God. I'm not going to give up. Yeah. I'm not going to give up on you, God. Yeah. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to keep going.
Fabulous.
Isn't that right, dog?
Fabulous. Schrader's come to inspect your wonderful white legs a little bit closer.
They're much browner, really.
I think television is deceptive. Puts 5 stone on you and makes you look browner than you are. Can I say thank you for joining with us this evening? It's been wonderful. Hopefully you've not suffered too much through our discussions. One of the things I would say is that if you do feel alone, if you're really, really struggling, do email qol@scbc.org.uk with a prayer request, and we will happily pray for you. We can't fix you. We can't do counselling. There's so many things that we can't do, but we can pray. And we believe in a God who hears our prayers. We believe in a God who answers our prayers. So if it's you right now, you're struggling, you're thinking, I don't know what to do, where do I go? Or you want to talk a little bit more about any of this, email us qol@scbc.org.uk. Also, if you've just joined us for the first time tonight, go onto our website, because there's lots of other videos. There's the whole series that we've done before this that you can look at. We've also got devotionals. You've been doing some talks on John's Gospel. What are you talking about this week? Where are we up to with
tomorrow, I hope, if not tomorrow, Friday, there will be a talk on how can I explain what it's about? It's about God giving us a role.
Okay, excellent. Do have a look at those. Donald is working his way through the book of John bit by bit. fantastic insights, helping us to understand Jesus, helping us to understand ourselves and life, and just making it relevant and making sense of the Bible. So do check that out. Also, we have more live streams on Sunday. We have them at 8:30, 10:30 and 6:30. We don't do a traditional church service. What we feel is right for us to do is to gather the church together virtually, and we pray together. So we really, as I said, believe that God answers prayer, that prayer makes a difference. So we want to pray for each other. We want to pray for our country, for our world, for our NHS, for our teachers, our key workers, in different and interesting ways. So we don't just sit around like that having some kind of boring prayer meeting, but we hear news from others through videos. There's a little bit of humour thrown in there as well. There's a little bit of singing. Our wonderful worship group put together various songs for us to enjoy. So join with us at any of our live streams. But it's been wonderful to have you with us. So we're going to say good night from me, from Donald, and from Shrade.
Cheerio.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.